Hey everyone, and welcome to our first webinar series discussing scam awareness. We're here at First Home Alliance. Again, my name is Nathan Daly. I'm excited to be able to present you such a very important topic that I know will protect you, your family, and make sure that your future is safe and secure. First, we want to start off with understanding what is a scam. How is it that people fall into being victims of scammers? And why is learning about scams so important? Well, first and most importantly, a scam is a scheme. It's a dishonest act to get someone to do something that they otherwise would not have done. It's a little bit different than some of the normal influences of our life. Being scammed is understanding that the person is ignorant of the actual scammer and the process in which that person engages. Why isn't learning about scams so important? Well, there's many reasons why it's important. But most importantly is that to get victims hooked on responding to scams, criminals typically rely on individuals who may feel a certain way. Sometimes you may be alone. Sometimes you may feel ashamed of your financial situation. Let's say you may find yourself in a financial hardship and an individual was coming to ask you or assist you in that hardship, and you unknowingly may not want to divulge all your information. Therefore, you may find yourself in a position of being compromised. Being socially isolated sometimes enhances the criminal's response to looking at you as a prey, as a victim. So you want to really watch that. Another reason that people fall victim to scams is because they have vulnerable circumstances. One of those major scams that always seem to find its way into American society happens typically after a disaster. By the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, most scams that occur typically happen after a hurricane has happened or an earthquake has happened. And yes, even now during a pandemic of 2020, lots of scams are always on the way. Victims come in all types of shapes and forms, ages and ethnicities, and scammers come from far, and some of them may be right next door to you. Looking at scams and understanding that, and understanding the victims and what they want, is one of the keys to protecting your wealth now and for your future children and the inheritance that you're going to leave them. And the fact that victims might not always admit or be aware that they're being victims of a crime. One thing to make sure you understand about scams is that it is a crime here in the United States. And the cycle of this victimization typically goes like this. Victims respond to a scam. Someone has prompted you to do something and you respond. And then they ask for personal details, adding to that victim's list. So they not just tell you that, hey, this opportunity for $100,000 exists, but then they start asking you personal details about your life. And then the criminals, what they typically will do is then to target their victims. Once they have targeted their victims, the victim will receive more scams and be introduced to more opportunities that are not real and that are by nature deceptive. And eventually what happens, as you know, that victim will lose money. This is very important to understand because when you get to this point, the consequences of falling for scams can be enormous. In this webinar series, we're going to discuss a little bit of those enormous consequences that come from falling for scams. One of them, and sadly this is very true, when people lose all of their wealth and all of their livelihood, some of them fall victim to attempted suicide. I've read this article many different times. You look at national trading standards and several different organizations, what they find is that people who are typically taken advantage of, who become victimized, suffer sometimes from a poor mental and physical emotional health. Of course, we all know that debts become a major issue. You owe the money that you were scammed into taking or that was taken from you. Sometimes in that debt that you owe, relationships become damaged. One of the biggest tolls that scammers in these type of situations cause on individual victims and innocent people is that they really tear apart families. It's really important to understand that they will come back even after they've scammed you, and what we call that is repeat victimization. More likely ended up in care. more likely to end up in care if you're a repeat victim. This is important because what happens is that you have to understand that there are multiple types of scams. And one of the things that says, if I've been scammed once, how can I get scammed again? How can I get scammed and become a repeat victim, a repeated victim? Well, there's several ways in which you can be scammed. And right now we're going to talk about just 4 of them. 1, postal scams. 2, telephone scams. 3, doorstep scams. And 4, online scams. Now, one of the most important things that you have to realize is that you've got to have some level of trust in the society. You've got to learn that eventually there comes a point where we all go through financial hardships, disasters, or have emergency circumstances, and we have to trust somebody with some of our personal details and information. But how we trust them and what we give them all comes down to us understanding these 4 different major types of scams. I'll repeat those again for you: the postal, telephone, doorstep, and online scams. Now let's start with the postal scams for right now. A victim in Yorkshire added together all the alleged winnings from a postal mail and over a 6-month period and said she won over $2.8 million. Well, obviously that all came from a lottery or prize draw scam where the person just continued sending them information. One of them came from catalog scams, the other from psychic scams, and then the last from an inheritance scams. All came through the mail. What we discovered at that time, and what many of the experts discovered, is that during the postal scam, the victim was actually led to believe that she was that lucky. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not you think that that person is. Just imagine if I came to your doorstep, or I sent you a letter and told you that you won $1 million in the mail. All you had to do was call this number. Would you call that number? Sometimes when we go through hardships, the postal scams seem to be the easiest. And back in several years ago, it was one of the major scams that were taken over. Now we have different type of scams, which we all see coming through our cell phones. And we call that the telephone scams, where that individual is now calling and phishing through, whether it's just simple phone calls, or if it's text messages, or it's just a simple investment or a pension scam where they say, hey, why don't you invest your money here because you'll have a better opportunity to make a return? Or it's just simply telling you to go back on the computer scam. The reality is that telephone scams are one of the most recent scams that people use. It's one of the most common scams that you will find even now on your phones. I can actually think of the time several months ago I got a phone call, and it was from the IRS telling me they were on their way to my house to confiscate all my belongings. In that conversation, they told me that if I didn't pay them an X amount of dollars, I can't remember the amount of money, that the IRS had sheriffs sitting outside ready to take all of my stuff. Now, me being a financial educator and a housing counselor, I understood that there was a lot more information that I needed before I could actually give this person or wire this person the money that they were asking for. But imagine if you did not understand how to recognize a scam. Most importantly, what if you were not even at your home because you were displaced for a disaster and you know that you had been working with the IRS? So there are scams that come in so many different ways. Telephone seems to be the most common one here in our age of smartphones. Another common scam, which doesn't happen often too much, but doorstep, they are still occurring, is a doorstep scam. And this is when you are legally entitled to a 14-day cooling off period for contracts that are made in your home. That's the most important part to know. What will happen and typically occur is someone will come to your door. Excuse me, sir, would you like your windows changed out and your gutters cleaned? All you have to do is sign up here, and we will have somebody out here tomorrow morning or the next week in order to help you and make sure that you are following the rules. Some may even throw in there that it is an HOA requirement and that every one of their neighbors are doing it. Well, these doorstep callers, what we call rogue traders or bogus callers, which are distraction for burglary, right? What we are found is that these doorstep scams typically involve you signing over or filling out a registration form to allow someone to come into your home and actually make changes in your home. Sometimes the scammer may never show up after if you have paid him the money. And other times they may say just leave the door unlocked and they'll come in and make those changes. You come back home to an empty home. All of these things happen, and they happen so fast. But the most easily found victim of scams have now occurred online. 53% of the population now view online crimes as seriously as they do physical crimes in the actual world, because they're destroying the notion of internet fraud is faceless and of a less importance than any other offense. I'll say that one more time. 50% of the population now view online crimes as seriously as physical world crimes, destroying the notion that internet crimes is faceless, internet fraud is faceless, and of less importance than any other offenses. Now, what are these internet and online scams that people typically fall for? I'm just going to point out 3 of them because I think they're very important, and then I'm going to point out the last one. The first one, of course, it's similar to the initial one of postal, and telephone, which is phishing. Just asking for information, just gauging and seeing where you're going, seeing who you are, what information they can gather from you. And then the next one is, of course, you guessed it, romance, actually. Romance scams are actually one of the major scams that happen online. How that occurs? Again, we go back to the victim being lonely. We go back to the victim being isolated. Sometimes when you feel isolated, you find that you want some type of companion and you find a friend. That friend may be a scammer. And it's important to note that scams online are typically more harmful because they have a lot more access and people tend to be more trusting because it is faceless. It is a faceless quote unquote crime. Last, there's impersonation of officials that you can find online. Have you ever gotten an email from someone who said that they were the official of a Walmart or the official of some type of local or state government agency? Those scams happen every day. Now, the biggest question is how do you spot a scam? How do you spot a victim? And how do scammers spot victims? And it's really simple. When we're looking at postal scams, they're going to spot their victims at the post office, at the mail. They're going to use stamps and checkbooks, products, and they're also going to entice you with free gifts. On telephone scams, they're going to ask for payments. They're going to send you text messages. They're going to say that they know your friends. But most importantly, they're going to be the helpful caller with new opportunities for you. The doorstep scams typically are poor quality these days because most people are not at home unless you're in the COVID era. But they always are asking for things that are unnecessary to be done to your house. They are always trying to use fear, and they use pressure tactics. They ask for cash withdrawals. So be very mindful of a scammer or someone coming to your doorstep only asking for cash withdrawals. And finally, the online scams is typically found in the suspicious emails, final demands, refunds, online relationships, and payments. It's easy to spot a victim because typically there's a financial hardship and or there's some self-neglect that typically happens in there. And anyone can be a victim of the scam. It could be your mother. It could be your grandmother. It could even be your child. It could even be you going through your college experience. It could even be you going to a simple online website just to find out new friends and people in the area who have common interest. It's really important to know what scammers are looking for in terms of their victims, but it's also important to note that it's more than just a person looking for your financial information. They could be looking for your health information. They could be looking to see if you're vulnerable. They could be looking to see if you're lonely, and they could be there to pressure you. They could also be looking for an opportunity to build a sense of purpose with you. And sometimes it's really important to know that not everything is for you, and not everything that you engage in is going to have the conclusion that that is intended from the very beginning. So scams are the product of organized predatory criminals. And who gain trust? These people gain trust to exploit and steal money, and use befriending and grooming techniques that appear legitimate. They're helpful, persuasive, and persistent, friendly even, charming and threatening, but they use aggressive and intimidating methods. So let's test your knowledge for a second. What do you think you can do to protect yourself and others from scams? Well, one of them is never disclose security details. Things like never disclose what type of security systems you have in your home. Never disclose to someone over the phone what type of virus protections that you have on your computer. It's really important to note that you never disclose your security details. Also, number two, one way to protect yourself is don't assume everyone is genuine. You have to do a little background. That brings me to number three, is that you don't want to rush into anything. It's always important to take your time, because when you take your time and understand a person or understand a simple product or service that they're offering, that will give you the leverage that you need in order to make a better informed decision. And most importantly, listen to your instincts. I can't tell you how many times that the instincts have saved me and saved many of the friends that I've been around from dangerous situations. Your instincts was given to you by nature itself, so that it could warn you of things that are coming that do mean to cause you harm. But finally, the most important thing, and we see this in any situation where there's panic, you have to stay in control. One of the things that scammers do, and they look for victims who they can emotionally manipulate and get out of control. It's very important that you understand what is happening, because when you lose control, that means that scammer will have found a way into whatever it is that you are trying to protect. So some more top tips of what you can do, which is important, is that you can talk, you can report, and you can contact your bank. Or what I would recommend is that you contact a HUD-approved housing counseling agency. One of the things we do here in the Prince William County, and we serve, of course, in Maryland and Prince George's and other areas in the United States, is that when we seek further help or we accept victims who are in need of counseling services because they've been scammed, we go through a whole process for intaking them and helping them to discover what exactly it is that has occurred to their life. We help them and we start figuring out what pieces, in fact, of their credit that has been damaged. We look at the debt and we look at the consequences of them being scammed. If you feel like you've been scammed, it really is important that you contact a housing counseling agency and get some further assistance. But one of the immediate things that you can do that I would really recommend if you're listening to this webinar is to take advantage of call blocking. You want to go ahead and start to protect yourself from nuisance and scam calls. Extra safety for vulnerable users, and it's also part of a phone. So if you go on your phone, it's easy to do, and it's part of the separate unit. Just contact your servicing agency. Another thing you can do to protect yourself from scams, of course, is to make sure that you are budgeting and finding the areas in your life that you already have a set financial goal for. In order to help with those financial goals, we also recommend going to get some further assistance. In some of our story, we see that people easily get scammed by just going to the mailbox. And if you, by no fault of your own, was preyed upon, well, it's important to contact a housing counseling agency, because we will be able to find a way to recover. In our next series, we're going to go into financial recovery. And specifically, when you take that series, I want you to consider what it would be like if you were in that predicament of being scammed. How would you then recover? We're going to contact a housing counseling agency and we're going to look into that intake. But most importantly, we're going to talk about what to do after we become a victim of a scam. But in order to protect yourself now, I really recommend that you retake this and listen to this seminar so that you know that being scammed could happen to anyone. And it's important to find yourself in a position where you know exactly where your money is going at all times. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next series.